As Sarah returned with Ghost, the shelter seemed to grow quieter, the sounds of barking and movements suddenly distant. Ghost wasn't like the other dogs. He was a stark contrast to the playful, excitable pups Emily had expected to see. He wasn't bounding towards the door, eager to meet the visitors. Instead, he slowly limped forward, his tail hanging low and his head drooping slightly. The years of neglect and the hardships he'd faced seemed to weigh him down, both physically and emotionally. Sarah, noticing the hesitation in Emily's eyes, gently placed her hand on her shoulder. "I know he doesn't look like much right now, but Ghost has a story," she said softly. "He's been here for over a year, waiting. He was found wandering the streets, and we don't know much about his past, but he's had a tough time adjusting. He doesn't always show it, but he's been hurt before, emotionally and physically." Emily nodded, but she couldn't look away from Ghost. His cloudy eyes seemed to carry a deep sadness, but there was something in them that called to her. A silent plea for help, maybe, or just a hope that someone might see past his weathered exterior. Sarah opened the kennel door, and Ghost hesitated for a moment before stepping out. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he wasn't sure where he was going or why he was being led out. As he shuffled into the open space, the other dogs in the shelter barked and howled, trying to get his attention, but Ghost remained unmoved. He kept his focus forward, his steps stiff and labored. Emily knelt down to his level, her heart beating faster as she watched him. "Hi, Ghost," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to startle him. "I'm Emily. I think you're beautiful." Sarah watched the scene with a mix of surprise and quiet curiosity. Most visitors to the shelter never took the time to see the overlooked dogs like Ghost, but Emily wasn't like most children. She didn't flinch when he came close, and when he stopped in front of her, she reached out slowly, her hand trembling ever so slightly. The moment was almost surreal. Ghost, who had been so distant with everyone else, stood still as Emily gently placed her hand on his head. It was a tentative touch at first, but then, as if sensing her calmness, he leaned into it. He closed his eyes and let out a soft sigh, a sound that almost sounded like relief. Emily didn't move. She kept her hand there, her fingers lightly brushing his fur. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to be scared anymore. I'm not going anywhere." Ghost's reaction was subtle but undeniable. He stayed close to her, his body language shifting just enough to show that he was starting to trust. It was a small step, but to those watching, it felt like a miracle. Sarah, who had been holding her breath, let out a quiet exhale. She had never seen Ghost react this way to anyone. "He's never let anyone get this close to him," she said, almost in disbelief. Emily's heart swelled with emotion. She knew, in that moment, that she couldn't leave the shelter without him. There was something about Ghost that felt different, something that made her want to help him, to show him that there was a home waiting for him, if he was willing to trust again. She turned to her parents, her voice firm. "I want to take him home. I don't care that he's not a puppy. He needs me, and I need him." Mark and Sarah exchanged another glance, this time softer, filled with understanding. They hadn't expected to be here, at this moment, but they could see the bond that had already started to form. It was clear that Emily had found the one dog she was meant to bring home. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and admiration. "I think that's a good choice," she said. "I think he's found his person." And so, with a final glance at the shelter's other dogs, Emily stood up, her hand still gently resting on Ghost's head. Together, they walked out of the shelter, a quiet understanding passing between them. Ghost had found a family, and Emily had found a companion who would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As Sarah returned with Ghost, the shelter seemed to grow quieter, the sounds of barking and movements suddenly distant. Ghost wasn't like the other dogs. He was a stark contrast to the playful, excitable pups Emily had expected to see. He wasn't bounding towards the door, eager to meet the visitors. Instead, he slowly limped forward, his tail hanging low and his head drooping slightly. The years of neglect and the hardships he'd faced seemed to weigh him down, both physically and emotionally. Sarah, noticing the hesitation in Emily's eyes, gently placed her hand on her shoulder. "I know he doesn't look like much right now, but Ghost has a story," she said softly. "He's been here for over a year, waiting. He was found wandering the streets, and we don't know much about his past, but he's had a tough time adjusting. He doesn't always show it, but he's been hurt before, emotionally and physically." Emily nodded, but she couldn't look away from Ghost. His cloudy eyes seemed to carry a deep sadness, but there was something in them that called to her. A silent plea for help, maybe, or just a hope that someone might see past his weathered exterior. Sarah opened the kennel door, and Ghost hesitated for a moment before stepping out. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he wasn't sure where he was going or why he was being led out. As he shuffled into the open space, the other dogs in the shelter barked and howled, trying to get his attention. But Ghost remained unmoved. He kept his focus forward, his steps stiff and labored. Emily knelt down to his level, her heart beating faster as she watched him. "Hi, Ghost," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to startle him. "I'm Emily. I think you're beautiful." Sarah watched the scene with a mix of surprise and quiet curiosity. Most visitors to the shelter never took the time to see the overlooked dogs like Ghost, but Emily wasn't like most children. She didn't flinch when he came close, and when he stopped in front of her, she reached out slowly, her hand trembling ever so slightly. The moment was almost surreal. Ghost, who had been so distant with everyone else, stood still as Emily gently placed her hand on his head. It was a tentative touch at first, but then, as if sensing her calmness, he leaned into it. He closed his eyes and let out a soft sigh, a sound that almost sounded like relief. Emily didn't move. She kept her hand there, her fingers lightly brushing his fur. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to be scared anymore. I'm not going anywhere." Ghost's reaction was subtle but undeniable. He stayed close to her, his body language shifting just enough to show that he was starting to trust. It was a small step, but to those watching, it felt like a miracle. Sarah, who had been holding her breath, let out a quiet exhale. She had never seen Ghost react this way to anyone. "He's never let anyone get this close to him," she said, almost in disbelief. Emily's heart swelled with emotion. She knew, in that moment, that she couldn't leave the shelter without him. There was something about Ghost that felt different, something that made her want to help him, to show him that there was a home waiting for him, if he was willing to trust again. She turned to her parents, her voice firm. "I want to take him home. I don't care that he's not a puppy. He needs me, and I need him." Mark and Sarah exchanged another glance, this time softer, filled with understanding. They hadn't expected to be here, at this moment, but they could see the bond that had already started to form. It was clear that Emily had found the one dog she was meant to bring home. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and admiration. "I think that's a good choice," she said. "I think he's found his person." And so, with a final glance at the shelter's other dogs, Emily stood up, her hand still gently resting on Ghost's head. Together, they walked out of the shelter, a quiet understanding passing between them. Ghost had found a family, and Emily had found a companion who would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The ride home was an eerie silence that hung in the air, broken only by the sound of Ghost's steady breathing. Emily sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her hand occasionally reaching over to gently touch his fur. Ghost, for the most part, remained still. He hadn't moved much since leaving the shelter, his large body curled tightly against the door, his head resting on his paws. There was no excitement, no joy in his demeanor. But Emily didn't mind. She understood. She had read enough books and watched enough movies to know that it might take time for Ghost to adjust. He had been through so much, too much, maybe, for him to instantly trust. She didn't expect miracles. She just wanted him to know that he was safe now. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Emily couldn't help but smile. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Ghost was home. Mark and Sarah both stepped out of the car, and they stood there for a moment, watching as Emily slowly opened the door on the passenger side. Ghost, hesitant as always, didn't make a move. Emily gently coaxed him. "Come on, Ghost. It's okay. This is your new home. I promise." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as though hearing her for the first time, Ghost lifted his head and slowly stepped out of the car, his body stiff and uncertain. Emily stepped forward, her eyes full of hope, and slowly, carefully, she extended her hand toward him. "It's okay, Ghost," she repeated softly. "I'm not going to leave you." He took a cautious step toward her, then another. And then, as though a switch had been flipped, he suddenly turned and walked up the front steps of the house, his pace quickening just slightly. Emily, beaming with a mix of relief and excitement, followed him inside. The house felt different with Ghost in it. The space that had once seemed too big now felt warm, filled with promise. Emily led him to the living room and sat down, patting the spot next to her on the couch. Ghost, however, didn't seem to be in the mood for comfort. He wandered the room, sniffing at the corners and pacing back and forth. His eyes darted from the furniture to the open door and back to Emily, as though he was still unsure of what this place was, or whether he was allowed to feel safe here. Mark and Sarah watched quietly from the doorway. They could see the struggle in Ghost's eyes, the way he seemed to be holding back. It broke their hearts to think of what he had been through, to realize just how much time it would take for him to feel secure. For the first few hours, nothing much changed. Ghost would lie down on the rug in the corner of the living room, his body tense and still. Emily sat beside him, reading aloud from her favorite book, her voice gentle and soothing. She didn't push him to do anything. She just let him be. It wasn't until later that night, when Emily had gone to bed, that something remarkable happened. As she drifted off to sleep, she heard a soft sound, a gentle thud followed by a light rustling. She opened her eyes and glanced over at the foot of her bed. There, standing hesitantly, was Ghost. His eyes met hers for the briefest moment before he slowly lowered himself to the floor, curling up at the foot of the bed. Emily smiled softly. It was the first sign that Ghost was starting to trust her, that he felt, in some small way, that this place could be home. She reached down and stroked his fur, and this time, he didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, letting out a quiet sigh, and for the first time since meeting him, Emily felt that bond she had longed for. The night passed quietly. Ghost remained at her feet, calm and still, and for the first time in a long while, both of them finally seemed to rest easy. The first few days with Ghost were a mix of cautious steps and quiet moments. Emily had expected him to be nervous and withdrawn, but she hadn't fully prepared for how deep his hesitance would run. The house, though warm and welcoming, was still a strange place for him. He didn't immediately settle into the rhythm of family life, as Emily had hoped. Instead, he stayed mostly in the corner of the living room, staring out the window, his eyes distant, as though he were waiting for something to happen. Emily, though, never wavered in her commitment. She spent every moment she could with him, trying to make him feel at ease. In the mornings, she'd get up early to make him breakfast, setting his bowl down with a soft good morning and a pat on his head. Ghost would sniff the food, but rarely ate much at first. Emily would sit beside him, watching, waiting for a sign. By day 3, she began to notice small changes. One morning, as she sat reading her favorite book in the living room, she felt a soft nudge against her leg. Startled, she looked down to find Ghost standing there, his big brown eyes gazing up at her, his tail flicking slightly. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "You're here," she exclaimed softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Ghost didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his body language softening, as though he were finally starting to trust her. Emily grinned, her face lighting up. "You're really here, aren't you?" she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself. From that moment on, things began to shift. Ghost still wasn't the playful dog that Emily had imagined when she first thought of getting a pet. He didn't jump up excitedly when she came home, nor did he fetch toys or run around the backyard. But he started to follow her around the house, staying close, as if wanting to be near her. He'd lie on the rug in the living room, watching her as she did her homework, and sometimes, when she was alone in her room, she'd find him lying at the door, waiting for her to invite him in. On the fourth day, Emily decided to try something different. It was a beautiful afternoon, and she thought it might help if they spent some time outside. She opened the back door to the garden and stepped outside, looking back at Ghost. "Come on, boy," she called, her voice gentle but full of hope. "Let's go play." For a moment, Ghost didn't move. He stood at the door, his eyes scanning the open yard, uncertain. Then, almost tentatively, he stepped outside, taking in the fresh air and the sounds of birds chirping nearby. Emily smiled, her heart lifting, as she watched him slowly explore the space. He sniffed at the grass, his ears twitching at every new scent, and for the first time, she saw a hint of curiosity in his eyes. He wasn't running around, but he was no longer standing still either. Emily tossed a ball a few feet away, just to see what he would do. Ghost paused, his gaze flicking between the ball and her. Then, with a slow but deliberate movement, he walked over and nudged the ball with his nose. It wasn't exactly playing, but it was a start. Emily clapped her hands, her excitement bubbling over. "That's it, Ghost. Good boy." Ghost didn't seem to care much about the praise, but Emily couldn't help herself. She laughed, feeling a warm, comforting connection grow between them. She knelt down and gently scratched his ears. "You're doing great, Ghost. You're really doing great." The next day, Emily decided to take it further. She brought out a small frisbee and tossed it into the yard again. This time, Ghost hesitated for just a moment longer before he chased after it. He didn't quite catch it, but he didn't give up. And for Emily, that was all that mattered. For the first time, Ghost was showing signs of playfulness, of life. And though they hadn't reached the point where he was the carefree dog she had imagined, Emily knew in her heart that he was healing. Little by little, day by day, the bond they shared was growing stronger. As the days turned into weeks, Emily noticed a steady change in Ghost. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The dog who had once been a shadow of his former self, withdrawn, quiet, and almost lifeless, was beginning to show signs of life. His once dull coat had started to shine with a healthier sheen, and the weight he had lost during his time at the shelter seemed to be slowly returning. But most importantly, his eyes, once clouded with sadness, were now more alert, more aware. One afternoon, as Emily sat in the living room doing her homework, she glanced up to see Ghost standing at the door, looking out at the yard. His posture was different this time. Instead of his usual slouch, he stood tall and alert, ears perked as he watched the world outside. Emily paused, her pencil hovering over the page, and a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was progress. He was interested in his surroundings now, no longer retreating into his shell. "Do you want to go outside?" Emily asked, closing her book and standing up. She hadn't expected Ghost to react, but to her surprise, he turned toward her and trotted over, his tail wagging, though just a little. Emily's heart swelled. It was the first time she had seen him show any kind of excitement since the day he came home. Outside, Emily grabbed the ball again, her hand outstretched. Ghost hesitated for only a moment before walking over to her, nudging the ball with his nose. This time, though, there was something different in his movements. He was more confident. He nudged the ball again, then took a few steps back, his body poised. Emily grinned widely. "Go ahead, Ghost. You can do it." With a quick movement, Ghost darted forward, his paws patting across the grass. He didn't catch the ball, but the simple act of chasing it was a breakthrough. Emily clapped her hands in delight, her voice full of praise. "Good boy, Ghost. That was great." Over the next few days, they made a game out of it. Emily tossed the ball farther each time, and Ghost, slowly but surely, got better at retrieving it. He still wasn't the playful, bouncy dog she had imagined, but he was improving. He was trying. And that, in Emily's eyes, was everything. It wasn't just the physical changes that were remarkable. Ghost's behavior began to shift as well. He no longer spent all of his time lying on the rug, staring off into space. Instead, he started to follow Emily around the house, walking behind her as she did her daily tasks. Sometimes, when she sat down at the table to eat, Ghost would come and lie at her feet, his head resting gently on her lap. Emily would scratch behind his ears, and for a moment, there was nothing but peace between them. But the most heartwarming moment came one evening, when Emily was sitting on the couch, reading. Ghost, who had previously never shown much interest in being near her unless she called him, walked over and lay down beside her. His head rested on her foot, his body stretched out in a relaxed manner. Emily froze for a moment, not daring to move. Slowly, she reached down and placed her hand on his head, stroking his fur. Ghost didn't pull away. Instead, he sighed, a deep, contented sound, and closed his eyes. Emily's heart fluttered in her chest. She had always dreamed of this moment, the moment when Ghost would finally feel like he was truly home. And now, it was happening. "Thank you for trusting me, Ghost," she whispered softly, her voice filled with emotion. She didn't expect a response, but in that moment, she didn't need one. The quiet connection between them spoke louder than words ever could. Emily knew that this was only the beginning, that there were still more hurdles ahead. But for the first time, she truly believed that Ghost was healing, that he was starting to believe in the safety and love that she had promised him. He was no longer the dog nobody wanted. He was her dog, and together, they would face whatever came next. As the weeks continued to pass, Emily began to notice even more changes in Ghost. What had started as tentative steps toward trust had grown into something deeper, a true bond. The once cautious and withdrawn German Shepherd was slowly transforming into a loyal, loving companion. It wasn't just the little things, like the way his coat glistened more with each passing day, or the fact that he was eating more regularly. It was the way he responded to Emily's presence, the way he sought her out, and the way his body language softened whenever she was near. One afternoon, Emily and Ghost were outside in the backyard. The air was crisp and fresh, the autumn leaves swirling around them in golden gusts. Emily had decided to try something new, a walk. Ghost had shown so much progress, and she felt like he was ready to take it one step further. She picked up his leash and clipped it to his collar. Normally, Ghost would shy away from the leash, pulling back or simply sitting still, unsure of what it meant. But this time, when Emily approached him with the leash, Ghost didn't flinch. Instead, he stood up, his tail wagging ever so slightly, and allowed her to clip it on. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Are you ready for this?" she asked softly, though she didn't expect an answer. She opened the gate, and together, they stepped out onto the sidewalk. Ghost, at first, walked cautiously, his steps hesitant as he adjusted to the unfamiliar routine. But Emily was patient. She kept her pace slow, letting him take his time. As they walked down the street, Emily was amazed at how far Ghost had come. The dog who had once cowered in fear at the thought of leaving the safety of the house was now walking confidently beside her. He sniffed at every corner, his ears perking up at every new sound. Every once in a while, Emily would look down at him, and she'd catch him glancing back up at her, his brown eyes sparkling with curiosity and perhaps a little joy. "Good boy, Ghost," Emily said, her voice filled with warmth. Ghost didn't respond with any leaps or bounds, but he did pick up his pace just slightly, as if acknowledging the praise. Emily smiled and gave his leash a gentle tug, guiding him toward a park they passed by regularly. When they reached the park, Emily stopped and let Ghost lead the way. He trotted confidently ahead, his tail wagging now, a little faster with each step. Emily felt a sense of pride and fulfillment watching him. For so long, she had worried that Ghost might never be able to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The walks, the parks, the freedom. But now, those worries seemed like distant memories. Ghost was not just surviving anymore. He was living. They spent a few minutes in the park, Emily sitting on a bench while Ghost explored the open space. He sniffed the grass, his nose twitching as he took in the myriad of new scents. Emily could tell that he was enjoying himself, his body relaxed and his movements more fluid than they had been before. When it was time to leave, Emily called him back to her. Ghost, who had been investigating a particularly interesting patch of earth, trotted back without hesitation, his leash trailing behind him. As they walked home, Emily couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. The Ghost she had met at the shelter, withdrawn and uncertain, was now a dog who was beginning to trust, to enjoy life, and to find joy in the simplest of things. That night, after they returned home, Ghost did something that Emily had never thought he would do. He climbed onto the couch beside her, resting his head on her lap as she watched TV. He had always kept his distance, content to lie on the floor or in his corner, but now he seemed to want to be closer. Emily looked down at him, her fingers gently scratching behind his ears, and she smiled. "I'm so proud of you, Ghost," she whispered, her heart swelling with affection. Ghost let out a soft sigh, his eyes half closed, clearly content. Emily knew that this was just the beginning of their journey together. The road ahead might still be filled with challenges, but she was ready for them. She had learned that love and patience could heal even the deepest wounds, and as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't face. As autumn slowly faded into winter, the bond between Emily and Ghost grew even stronger. The once cautious German shepherd, who had arrived at her home with a heart full of scars, had become a different dog. He was no longer the same dog who flinched at sudden movements or hid in corners. Ghost now moved with a quiet confidence, his body relaxed, his eyes full of trust. One snowy Saturday morning, Emily and Ghost took their usual walk through the neighborhood. The ground was covered in a soft blanket of snow, and the air had that crisp chill that made everything feel fresh and new. As they strolled along, Emily noticed a change in Ghost. He wasn't just walking by her side. He was actively engaging with his surroundings. He darted toward the piles of snow, digging through it with his paws, clearly enjoying the sensation of the cold crystals. Emily laughed, her heart warming at the sight. "You're a snow dog now, aren't you?" she teased, throwing a snowball ahead of him. Ghost, ever the curious companion, immediately chased after it, his tail wagging with excitement. He didn't catch the snowball, but he didn't seem to mind. His joy was in the chase itself. The transformation was undeniable. Ghost had gone from a dog who barely acknowledged his environment to one who actively sought out new experiences. His playful side had emerged in ways Emily had never imagined. Though he still wasn't the exuberant, jumping dog that many people expected from their pets, he was growing into the dog he was always meant to be. The trust he had in Emily allowed him to experience life in a way he had never known before. When they returned home from their walk, Emily's parents noticed the change too. Sarah, who had been skeptical at first, couldn't help but smile as she watched Ghost interact with Emily. "He really has come a long way, hasn't he?" she remarked, watching as Ghost lay by Emily's feet while she did her homework. Mark nodded, his eyes softening as he observed the scene. "It's amazing to think about how far he's come. You've done a great job with him, Emily." Emily beamed at their praise, but she knew deep down that it wasn't just her. Ghost had put in just as much effort. Every step of the way, he had chosen to trust her, to open up, and to be brave in the face of his fears. And with each passing day, the reward was clear. As December rolled in, Emily decided to take Ghost to the local park again, this time with more intention. She had been practicing obedience training with him, and though Ghost wasn't perfect, he had learned to sit on command and walk calmly beside her. Emily wanted to show her progress, to give Ghost the opportunity to shine. When they arrived at the park, she took a deep breath, watching as Ghost trotted confidently ahead of her. She called out his name. "Ghost, sit." He paused, looked at her for a moment, and then sat down immediately. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected him to follow through so quickly, but there he was, obedient and calm, waiting for her next instruction. "Good boy, Ghost," Emily exclaimed, her voice filled with pride. She crouched down to give him a treat, praising him for his good behavior. Ghost's tail wagged happily, and he took the treat from her hand, his eyes full of contentment. As Emily continued to work with him on commands, other parkgoers watched in amazement. They had seen Ghost when he was first adopted, an anxious dog with little to no faith in humans. To see him now, calm and focused, was nothing short of miraculous. One older couple approached Emily with smiles on their faces. "We remember when you first brought him in," the woman said, her voice warm. "You've done a wonderful job with him. It's incredible to see how far he's come." Emily smiled shyly, her cheeks flushing with the compliment. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "He's really become such a good boy." As they walked home that day, Ghost seemed lighter, freer, more like the dog he was always meant to be. The snowflakes swirled around them, but it didn't matter. Emily and Ghost had their own little world now, one where trust, patience, and love had transformed them both. And as the cold winter days passed, Emily knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. She wasn't just saving Ghost. He had saved her too. Winter had settled in, but Emily and Ghost's bond only grew stronger as the days turned into months. The dog who once feared the world outside had come to love the warmth of his family and the joy of exploring the world with Emily by his side. The scars from his past, though never forgotten, were no longer as visible. His trust in her was unwavering, and that trust had healed more than just the wounds on his body. It had healed his heart. One chilly evening after a long day of school and work, Emily sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, and Ghost, as usual, lay by her feet. She absent-mindedly ran her fingers through his fur, smiling at the calmness that had overtaken him. He no longer feared loud noises or sudden movements. He no longer hid away or shrank back. Ghost was no longer a ghost of a dog. He was a full, vibrant soul who had found his place in the world. That night, Emily's parents decided to do something special for Ghost. They all gathered around the living room with a gift wrapped in bright paper. Ghost, curious as always, tilted his head as Emily held the gift in front of him. "What's this, Ghost?" "A little surprise for you," she whispered, her voice full of excitement. As Emily unwrapped the gift, it revealed a soft, plush dog bed with his name embroidered on the side. Ghost stepped forward cautiously, sniffing the bed before slowly lying down on it. Emily laughed softly as he curled up, clearly content, his head resting gently on the plush surface. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized everything they had worked toward: safety, comfort, and a place to call home. Over the next few weeks, the changes in Ghost became even more pronounced. He was more playful, more affectionate, and more willing to engage with others. Emily had invited a few friends over to meet Ghost, and instead of retreating into the corner as he used to, he greeted them with cautious curiosity, his tail wagging gently. He was slowly learning to trust not just Emily, but the world around him. It was a significant milestone, one that made Emily's heart swell with pride. At the local park, Ghost had begun to run and play with other dogs. While he wasn't as energetic as some of the younger dogs, he was slowly beginning to enjoy the simple pleasures of being a dog, chasing a ball, sniffing around, and even rolling in the grass. Emily couldn't help but smile each time she watched him interact with the other dogs. There was a certain peace in his movements now, as though he had finally accepted that he was no longer alone in the world. One evening, after a long walk in the park, Emily stopped at the bench where they had first sat together all those months ago. She gently patted the spot beside her, and Ghost obediently sat down next to her, resting his head on her lap as he had done so many times before. They sat there in the quiet of the evening, watching the stars slowly emerge in the sky. "I couldn't have asked for a better friend," Emily whispered softly, stroking his fur. "You're my best friend, Ghost." And for the first time, it wasn't just a moment of healing, it was a moment of true understanding. Ghost wasn't just a dog anymore. He was her companion, her confidant, her family. And she, in turn, was the person who had given him a second chance at life. As they sat together on that bench, surrounded by the calm of the world, Emily knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more growth, more moments of love. But together, they had built a life. One that was filled with trust, healing, and the kind of love that could overcome anything. And as the cold winter night wrapped around them, Emily felt a sense of peace that only came from knowing that, no matter what happened, Ghost would always be by her side. Forever.